Hey, I'm Kale, and today I'm covering Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Crosby, Stills, and Nash is the first album released by the supergroup of the same name, released May 29th, 1969. The group consisted of David Crosby, who was the vocalist and guitarist for the Byrds, Stephen Stills, who was the vocalist and guitarist for Buffalo Springfield, and Graham Nash of the Hollies, who was the backing vocalist and rhythm guitarist for the Hollies. This album is generally considered to be one of the first Laurel Canyon albums, along with Joni Mitchell's album from a year previous, Song to a Seagull, which was actually produced by David Crosby. Now I'm going to get into the backstory of how the band formed. One could say that the band kind of started in June of 1967 when David Crosby in June of 1967 at the Monterey Pop Festival, where David Crosby joined the stage with Buffalo Springfield with Stephen Stills. This kind of angered members of the Byrds and is actually one of the main reasons why David Crosby got kicked out of the Byrds a little less than a year later. Then a little less than a year later, David Crosby gets kicked out of the Byrds, and he has nothing to do. And Graham Nash leaves the Byrds Graham Nash leaves the Hollies because he has nothing to do. And Stephen Stills leaves Buffalo Springfield because he has nothing to do. And basically, Graham Nash and Stephen Stills meet at a party at Mama and the Papas member Cass Elliott's house, and they just kind of were like, hey, you want to start a band? And then they remembered their old buddy David Crosby and were like, hey, you want to join our band? And that's basically how the band got formed. Now, before I get into recording details and things like that, I want to talk about the drama surrounding the cover of this album. So this cover was taken sometime in early 1969 at a random abandoned house in Laurel Canyon. Everything went swimmingly. Yeah, they're sitting on the couch in the front. Their session drummer, Dallas Taylor, even gets a little thing in the back. And then 2 weeks before the album is released, they realize that the picture's in the wrong order. It goes Nash, Stills, Crosby, which is not actually how the band is, if you didn't know. So they're like, oh no, it's no big deal. The house is only like 50 minutes away. We'll just go back and then we'll reshoot the photo. So they pull up to where the house was, and it's just gone. The house is just not there anymore. It got taken, like, completely torn down or something. The house just disappeared. Like, this was all weird. But, so they got back to the studio and they were like, well, we could just reverse the picture. But then Stephen Stills would be holding his guitar in the wrong hand, so they just decided to have the picture reversed and have David Crosby's name over Graham Nash's name, Stephen Stills' name over Stephen Stills' name, and then Graham Nash's name over David Crosby's name. It's a little confusing. Anyway, the personnel. Well, we got Stephen Stills on guitar, acoustic guitar, bass, percussion, keyboards, piano, on basically every single track. This is literally a true story. He pulled an all-nighter one night and basically just recorded every single instrument for this entire album. Then you got David Crosby on vocals and rhythm guitar, and then Graham Nash on vocals and some acoustic guitar. And for additional session musicians, there's Dallas Taylor on drums and Jim Gordon on drums. And it was essentially self-produced by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But let's get into the recording. The album was basically recorded over the span of 4 weeks, with Stephen Stills on majority of the instruments, and they basically produced it by themselves. There's really not much interesting about the recording other than the fact that Stephen Stills really pulled an all-nighter and recorded every single instrumental part on this album. So I guess with that very small recording thing, we'll get into the track-by-track breakdown. Track number 1 is Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. Based off the title alone, I'm sure you can guess that it is a musical suite consisting of like 4 or 5 different musical parts. And it was written for musician Judy Collins, who Stephen Stills was dating at the time. And basically it was written because she was going to break up with Stills because she was involved in this weird therapy cult. And it basically caused her to have a mental breakdown and then just cut off ties with everyone. And the song is basically a plea for her to stay, and it didn't work. Yeah, she still broke up with him, and he really hates talking about the song. But musically, it is kind of insane that Stephen Stills did literally every instrument on this song except for drums. In like basically less than 48 hours, mind you. It's also probably Crosby, Stills, and Nash's most well-known song, and one of Stephen Stills' most well-known songs, aside from For What It's Worth. And it's also my second favorite track on the album. That's right. I'm numbering them now. Track number 2 is the Marrakesh Express. It was written by Nash in 1966 or 1967 while he was in the Hollies while on a train trip tour throughout Casablanca and Marrakesh. He said the song was basically about he was in the first class cabin and he thought everyone was really boring, so he started walking around, and it turns out this train was a little kooky, if you will. It was a little goofy, kooky, silly train. And he basically wandered around the animal cabin with a bunch of goats and chickens. Really riveting stuff. Nash made a demo for it for the Hollies in early 1967, but the Hollies said, no, it's too poppy, which is really stupid because the Hollies are the most pop-centric band I've ever heard. Graham Nash really did not seem to fit in with the Hollies at all. It's probably why he looked so sad in the All You Need Is Love music video. Which I only just learned he was in, by the way. There's a bunch of people in that music video. There's Keith Moon, Eric Clapton, Graham Nash, the Beatles. I'm getting sidetracked. Next track is Guinevere. Guinevere was written by David Crosby either during or shortly after he was kicked out of the Byrds. It's kind of in a weird time signature, and it's structured off of old English folk music. And the lyrics are based off of the English folktale of Guinevere and Lancelot. And it's basically entirely acoustic with David Crosby on acoustic guitar and vocals, and then Graham Nash singing in the background. Just Crosby and Nash. Next is You Don't Have to Cry. It's one of the songs on this album that is literally just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. There's no other session musicians. It's just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And it's also probably also about Judy Collins. It's underrated too. I always forget about it when I start listening to it, but it's a nice song. Next up is Pre-Road Downs. Pre-Road Downs was written entirely by Nash, and he hits some absolute high notes on this song. Oh my goodness. Also, Cass Elliot from Mamas and the Papas is on backing vocals in this song. It's all connected. One of the more rockier songs on this album, like a sort of like a Holly song or a Bird song. And it has a reversed guitar solo, which I thought were completely gone by 1967, but they're back and they're really hitting in 1969. It's like a jangly reversed guitar solo. It's like if Beatles for Sale Beatles and Revolver Beatles crossed paths and made a guitar solo. And that closes out side 1. And opening side 2 is Wooden Ships. Wooden Ships was co-written by David Crosby and Paul Kantner of Jefferson Airplane. And Jefferson Airplane actually recorded their own version for their album Volunteers, released in November in 1969. I actually prefer the Jefferson Airplane version to the Crosby, Stills, and Nash version a little bit. The song, like a lot of songs from 1969, is a metaphor for the war in Vietnam, and the song is like a conversation between two survivors of nuclear fallout, and then their main takeaway is basically, war is stinky. And this is one of the songs where Dallas Taylor does in fact do drums. Next up is Lady of the Island, written by Nash. Lady of the Island was written by Nash in 1967 or 1968 when he was in the Hollies, and yet again, the Hollies turned it down. It wasn't written with her in mind, but it was definitely recorded with Joni Mitchell in mind, as Nash and her were actually dating at the time. Next up is Helplessly Hoping, written by Stills. Helplessly Hoping, yet again, is also probably about Judy Collins, because like every single song written by Stephen Stills on this album is about Judy Collins. It's really sad. It's also one of the songs on this album that only features Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and no other session musician. It's structured like an American folk song from the 19th century. That's what I noticed. It sounds like a folk song from the South from the 1860s. And I know it's very specific, but that's what it sounds like to me. You know, along the lines of like Dink's song or The Drinking Gourd. And next there's Long Time Gone, written by Crosby. Long Time Gone is one of the non-folk songs on this album. It's actually very rock heavy. It's like a protest rock. It's mostly about the JFK assassinations because it was written on the night of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. And you may think I'm going to make a conspiracy theory about that, but no. My conspiracy theory is David Crosby sounds an awful lot like Kermit the Frog on this song, not like David Crosby. This raises the question, is David Crosby Kermit the Frog? Oh, that was really stupid. But yeah, you know, it's your basic protest song from 1969 about, you know, the JFK assassination, Vietnam, all the conflicts happening in the mid to late 60s. It's almost like a teaser to Ohio, which they recorded with an extra member, which I will get to someday. It was Neil Young, but it really does sound like the precursor to Ohio. Lastly is 49 Bye-Bye by Stills, also about Judy Collins. It's okay as a closer. Personally, I would have put Sweet Judy Blue Eyes as a closer and 49 Bye-Byes as an opening. Now, I know it's called 49 Bye-Byes, so it would be like, oh, it's going to be at the end, but like it works better as an opener, and Sweet Judy Blue Eyes would be an epic ending. Also, look at this thing again. Also, I counted, and there are not 49 Bye-Byes in this song. I can't remember how many I counted, but it was not 49, which is just a missed opportunity. But yeah, that's every track on Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Let's get into my thoughts and other miscellaneous things. And Cat. Now, before I get into the actual my thoughts part, I just want to say an interesting fact about this. Crosby, Stills, and Nash performed at Woodstock, and that sounds obvious. Like, yeah, of course they did that, but it was only their second show ever as a band, so they really had no time to rehearse for one of the biggest music festivals in history. They just kind of went out there. And that's actually how they got Young recruited, because Neil Young was there doing his own set, and they just brought him out on stage, and they were like, this is Neil Young, and he is also gonna do the thing. Neil Young was another guitarist in Buffalo Springfield, where Stephen Stills was. They go way back. Anyway, my thoughts. There's a lot of supergroups out there. You got Cream, you got Crosby, Stills, Nash, you got what else? Oh, you got Blind Faith, and you got Derek and the Domino. I just realized 3 of those bands have Eric Clapton in them. But out of those 3, I personally think that Crosby, Stills, and Nash is the second best. I would argue Cream is a little bit better, but as a folk rock supergroup, these were the ideal members, especially Crosby and Stills, who had already, you know, cemented themselves as these psychedelic folk gods of the mid-60s. And Nash was just happy to tag along. No, but oh my god, could you imagine how boring the harmonies would sound without Graham Nash? And I much prefer this album to their second album, Deja Vu, with Neil Young. I'm really not that big of a Neil Young fan. I think his 3 greatest works are Buffalo Springfield Again, Deja Vu, and Harvest. In 2 of those albums, he happens to just be with Stephen Stills. Seems like there's a pattern here. But yeah, this is a great album. If you haven't listened to it in full before, I highly recommend it. But anyway, yeah. Bye, bozos.